Hey, what's going on? We are talking bands today. We are talking marginalized and underappreciated bands on my show called The Outsiders. We do this as much as we can, once or twice a month. And today we are talking about the New York Dolls, right? Formed in 1971. And really, they predated punk. They kind of predated glam. They influenced Kiss, the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, the Damned, Guns N' Roses, Poison, the Smiths. You know, they were known for their androgynous wardrobe, high heels, makeup, spandex, wearing dresses, eccentric hats, wearing satin. And they really did things their way early on. Again, this is 1971. They performed their first gig in New York in December of 71. You know, their sound was like a mix between the grittiness of the Stones. Singer David Johansen kind of does that Mick Jagger thing, the strutting around. It's dangerous and it's dirty, and they have a swagger. But you also have the bombast of Iggy Pop and the Stooges and some of the glammy elements of T-Rex and David Bowie going on. Again, they started in 71 with guitarist Johnny Thunders, guitarist Rick Revitz, bassist Arthur Kane, the Killer, drummer Billy Murcia, and singer David Johansen. You know, they had a hard time finding a recording contract because of the cross-dressing, because of the blatant vulgarity in their act. Just a tough time getting a deal. Rivets is ultimately replaced by Sylvain in early 1972, and they start to develop a cult following in 72. Okay. They do go to Europe on a brief tour in November of 72, and drummer Billy Murcia dies of an overdose. They tried to revive him, and he is not able to be revived, and he passes away. They replace him. First, they look at a guy who would become known as Marky Ramone and Peter Criss, who would ultimately go on to join Kiss. Neither one take the job, and ultimately Jerry Nolan takes the job, and you do then have your classic lineup here. Okay. Again, classic New York Dolls lineup. After Nolan comes on board, they are able to get a record contract with Mercury Records. They are able to acquire pop genius Todd Rundgren to produce that record. And the debut album, The New York Dolls, is released to great critical acclaim. Problem is, nobody buys the record. The thing stalls on the charts at 116th place in the Billboard charts. You know, it includes classic cult staples like Personality Crisis, Trash, Jet Boy. You know, again, the critics like this band, but if it doesn't sell, you know, Mercury's already upset with this band. And, you know, they get back in the studio after that 1973 debut. They bring in a new producer, and they put out Too Much Too Soon, the second record. It's got great songs like Chatterbox on it. Great song like Babylon on it. Again, the critics like this group. And it's 1974, but it fails commercially, and they are dropped by the record company. Here's a picture of David Johansen. Dropped by the record company. So who do they bring in to manage the group? They bring in Malcolm McLaren, who would later go on to make the Sex Pistols famous, but he first works with the Dolls, and he decides to use shock values publicity, which has worked throughout the history of music, but it fails miserably here. Again, they don't have a record contract. He has them dress up in red leather, playing and dancing in front of the USSR flag in 1974, and instead of creating publicity with shock value, it just further deepens the fact that these record companies want nothing to do with them. Finally, Thunders quits. Nolan leaves the band, and the band's left to Johansson and Sylvain, who assemble new lineups. They fire Malcolm McLaren, and these new lineups flounder around through the end of 1976, and the band disbands. Now, yes, they've had 2 records. Early on, in England, the president of the New York Dolls fan club is a guy named Morrissey, who ends up founding the Smiths. So they've made an impact on people. And a lot of bands have done this over time. The MC5, which we've done a show. By the way, subscribe to my channel. We do shows every single day. Iggy and the Stooges, MC5, bands like this who aren't really commercially successful do end up making a cultural impact. Johnny Thunders puts his own band together with Nolan on drums called the Heartbreakers. They do fairly decently. They're just doing club shows. Ultimately, Johnny Thunders dies in a hotel room in New Orleans in 1991. Nolan, the drummer, has a stroke a few months later. So we've lost now 2 founding members of the band. Like I said before, Morrissey decides to get the remaining guys together. So you have Arthur Kane on bass. You have Sylvain on guitar. Here's a picture of Sylvain. And he gets David Johansson, and they have a very successful reunion show that's recorded for a DVD and a CD in 2004 in England. At which point they decide to keep the band going. Well, Arthur Kane goes back to Los Angeles and has symptoms of what he thinks is the flu and checks himself into the hospital, where he is diagnosed with leukemia and dies hours later. And on July 13th, 2004, another founding member has passed away. There's a documentary on Arthur Kane that's really worth watching. It's sad, He's a rock star that saw the, kind of nearings of pinnacle of success, loses that, and then comes back for this reunion tour or reunion show where it's successful enough, and then he passes away days later. Well, Johansson, who you may also know as Buster Poindexter. So in the 80s, he puts on a persona called Buster Poindexter. Feeling hot, 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 that song. And he has a successful kind of career as this lounge singer guy. I ended up seeing them. They got back together in 2011 with Earl Slick, who played with Bowie, with Kenny Aronson and drummer Jason Sutter, and the Dolls with Sylvain and David Johansson went back on tour in 2011, opening up for Poison and Motley Crue, and it was fantastic. One of the highlights and funny things as a frontman would say is, in between songs, is like, so what do you think about that new German Pope? And then just stands there. It was just such an odd thing to say, but it was also very rock and roll. And the swagger that they displayed that night and kind of the energy, opening up for a band, Poison, who I'm not crazy about, but you could hear that music in Poison. I mean, they're direct copies of some of these songs. Anyway, check out the New York Dolls. Check out those 2 albums. Check out Personality Crisis and Trash and some of those great songs that they did, Chatterbox. Peace out. Subscribe to my channel. Check it out. See you.